It was just another busy morning at Atlanta International Airport, with the usual symphony of rolling suitcases and hurried footsteps echoing through the terminal. Staff Sergeant James Chen couldn't help but smile as he adjusted his crisp military uniform, thinking about his family waiting for him back home. After 3 grueling tours in Afghanistan, he was finally heading back to surprise his kids, who thought he wouldn't be home for another week. The morning sun streamed through the huge glass windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor as Chen joined the security line. His body was tired from the long flight from overseas, but his spirit was high. He had missed so many little moments with his family. His daughter's piano recital, his son's first baseball game of the season. And now he was just hours away from making up for lost time. Around him, travelers fumbled with their laptops and toiletries, preparing for the security check. A young mother struggled with her toddler while trying to fold a stroller. Without hesitation, Chen stepped forward to help her, earning a grateful smile. That's just who he was, always ready to lend a hand, whether in combat zones or airport terminals. The line moved steadily, and Chen watched as other service members in uniform passed through security with quick nods from the TSA officers. He could almost taste his mom's famous dumplings that she had promised to make for his return. His phone buzzed, another text from his wife asking about his delayed flight next week. Keeping the surprise was getting harder by the minute. As he approached the security checkpoint, Chen noticed Officer Reynolds watching him with an unusual intensity. Something in the officer's gaze made Chen's combat-trained instincts tingle. After 15 years of service, he had developed a sixth sense for trouble, and right now, it was sending him clear signals that this wouldn't be a routine screening. The morning crowd continued to flow around them, unaware of the tension building at the checkpoint. Business travelers rushed past with their briefcases, families herded excited children toward their vacation destinations, and airline crew members hurried to their next flights. Chen took a deep breath, reminding himself that he had handled much worse situations in his military career. Just as he reached the front of the line, Reynolds raised his hand to stop him. Chen noticed how the officer barely glanced at the white serviceman who had just passed through, but now stared at his military ID with exaggerated suspicion. The contrast was impossible to miss, and a few nearby passengers began to slow down, sensing that something wasn't right. Chen's hand tightened slightly around his carry-on strap, but his face remained composed. Years of military discipline had taught him how to stay calm under pressure. He watched as Reynolds' expression shifted from suspicion to something more confrontational, and he knew that the next few moments would test everything he had learned about patience, dignity, and standing up for what's right. The air seemed to grow thicker with tension as other travelers began to notice the unusual scrutiny Chen was facing. A few pulled out their phones, their instincts telling them that they might be about to witness something significant. Chen stood tall, his combat boots planted firmly on the airport floor, ready to face whatever came next with the same courage that had earned him commendations overseas. Little did anyone know that this ordinary morning at Atlanta International Airport was about to become a moment that would spark important changes in how people are treated at security checkpoints across the country. For Staff Sergeant James Chen, it was simply another chance to live up to the values he had sworn to protect. The tension at the security checkpoint grew as Officer Reynolds held up Staff Sergeant Chen's military ID, turning it over and over in his hands. "We're going to need additional verification," he announced loudly, his voice carrying across the terminal. Other travelers watched as Chen, who had just spent months serving his country, was being treated like a suspicious character. "Is there a problem with my military ID?" Chen asked calmly, though his heart was beating faster. He'd faced gunfire and explosions without flinching, but this kind of treatment in his own country hit differently. Around him, the morning airport buzz had grown quieter, with nearby passengers slowing down to watch the scene unfold. "I need to make sure this is real," Reynolds said, emphasizing the word real in a way that made several onlookers shake their heads in disbelief. A businessman in line behind Chen couldn't help but noticed that just minutes earlier, Reynolds had barely glanced at another soldier's ID before waving him through with a smile. Chen stood straight, his uniform pressed and perfect, just like the discipline he was showing. "Sir, that's a valid military ID. I've just returned from my third tour in Afghanistan." His voice was steady, professional, the voice of someone who had briefed generals and led troops into combat. But Reynolds wasn't backing down. "You people always have some story," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. An elderly couple exchanged glances, the wife pulling out her phone and starting to record. A flight attendant rushing past slowed down, then stopped completely, watching with growing concern. The line behind Chen grew longer, but nobody complained. Instead, they watched as this soldier faced discrimination with remarkable composure. A group of high school students on a field trip stopped their chatter, their young faces showing confusion and anger at what they were witnessing. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," Chen said firmly, pulling out his own phone to document the interaction. He thought about his kids at home, about the lessons he wanted to teach them about standing up for what's right. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. Other TSA officers nearby started shifting uncomfortably, clearly aware that their colleague was out of line. A young officer even took a few steps forward, looking like she wanted to intervene, but Reynolds waved her away. The morning sun continued to stream through the airport windows, now illuminating a scene that would soon become a powerful example of standing up to prejudice. Chen took out his military service record and combat decorations, laying them carefully on the security desk. "Officer Reynolds," he said, noting the name badge, "I've spent the last 15 years defending everyone's right to fair treatment. I'm not asking for special privileges, just the same respect you've shown to every other service member this morning." The crowd had grown larger now, with people stopping to witness this quiet but powerful confrontation. Parents were explaining in hushed voices to their children why this was wrong. Business travelers had set down their briefcases, forgotten their rush to catch flights. What started as a simple security check had turned into a moment that would stick in everyone's memory. As Reynolds continued his unnecessary scrutiny, nobody realized that this situation was about to take an unexpected turn. One that would not only change this airport's policies, but would spark a conversation about respect, dignity, and what it truly means to serve one's country. The situation at the security checkpoint had drawn quite a crowd. People stood with their phones raised, capturing the moment when Officer Reynolds' behavior crossed another line. "Maybe you should try the other security lane," he said with a smirk, pointing to a lane that was clearly closed. "You know, where you'll feel more comfortable." The crowd's reaction was immediate. A soft-spoken elderly woman stepped forward, her voice shaking with emotion. "I've been traveling through this airport for 40 years, she said, "and I've never seen anything like this." Her husband stood beside her, nodding firmly, his hand steady as he continued recording everything on his phone. Chen looked at his watch, thinking about his connecting flight, about his kids waiting at home, about the surprise homecoming he planned so carefully. But something deeper kept him standing there, the same sense of duty that had driven him through 3 tours overseas. "Officer Reynolds," he said clearly, "I understand you're doing your job. But what you're doing right now isn't security. It's harassment." A young college student who'd been watching spoke up from the line. "He's right. We all saw how you treated the other soldiers who came through." Others in the crowd murmured in agreement, and someone added, "I've got it all on video, sir. Every single minute." Reynolds' face reddened, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Well, if you've got nothing to hide," he started, but was interrupted by the arrival of 2 more TSA officers. They'd been watching from their posts, and their faces showed they'd seen enough. The older of the 2 officers, a man with gray hair and kind eyes, stepped forward. "I think we need to handle this differently," he said quietly to Reynolds. But Reynolds wasn't having it. He puffed up his chest and said loudly, "I'm following protocol. This is a security matter." Chen remained perfectly still, his military training evident in his composed stance. He pulled out his phone and calmly started recording too. "I'd like to file an official complaint," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm going to need your badge number and your supervisor's contact information." A mother in the crowd whispered to her teenage daughter, who was watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "See, honey, this is what courage looks like. Standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." The daughter nodded, never taking her eyes off Chen. The atmosphere in the terminal had changed completely. The usual hurried airport rush had given way to something more important. People who would normally be rushing to their gates stood their ground, bearing witness. A pilot walking past stopped to observe, his face growing serious as he took in the scene. Someone in the crowd had pulled up the TSA's official regulations on their phone and was reading them aloud. Military personnel in uniform with valid identification should be expedited through security whenever possible. The words hung in the air, making Reynolds' actions even more obviously wrong. Chen thought about all the young soldiers he'd led, how he taught them about integrity and doing the right thing. He thought about his own children and how he wanted them to grow up in a world where people stood up against injustice. This moment, right here in this busy airport, was about more than just getting through security. It was about standing up for those values. The morning sun continued to stream through the terminal windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Nobody knew it yet, but in just a few minutes, everything was about to change. The head of airport security was already on her way down, having been alerted by multiple concerned staff members. This confrontation was about to become a turning point, not just for this airport, but for how people treat each other in moments that matter. The head of airport security arrived at the checkpoint, her footsteps quick and purposeful. The crowd parted to let her through, and you could feel the shift in the air. She took one look at the scene. Staff Sergeant Chen standing tall in his uniform. Officer Reynolds, still holding the military ID like it was something suspicious, and the crowd of witnesses with their phones raised, and knew exactly what was happening. "I need to see what's going on here," she announced, her voice carrying authority without aggression. She'd worked at this airport for 20 years, starting as a junior officer and working her way up. She'd seen it all, but this situation made her heart sink. Reynolds started speaking first, but the head of security held up her hand. "I've already received multiple reports from staff and passengers," she said. "Right now, I want to hear from Staff Sergeant Chen." Her approach immediately showed the difference between real leadership and the abuse of power. Chen spoke clearly and professionally, detailing everything that had happened. As he talked, a young boy in the crowd tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mom, why is that officer being mean to the soldier?" The mother hugged her son close, watching as justice was finally starting to unfold. The head of security listened carefully, her expression growing more serious with each detail. Around them, the airport continued its busy morning rush, but this corner of the terminal remained focused on the scene playing out. A group of international travelers watched intently, reminded of why they'd chosen to come to a country that was supposed to stand for justice and equality. Officer Reynolds, the head of security, said, turning to face him, "Please step aside. We'll discuss this in my office." Her tone left no room for argument. Reynolds' face turned red as he realized the tables had turned. The badge he'd been using to intimidate others suddenly felt heavy on his chest. A younger TSA officer stepped forward to take Chen's ID from Reynolds. She checked it quickly and professionally, just as it should have been done in the first place. "Thank you for your service, Staff Sergeant," she said, handing back his documents. "You're cleared to proceed." But Chen wasn't done. He looked at the head of security and said, "Ma'am, I'd like to file a formal complaint. Not for myself, but for anyone else who might face this kind of treatment." His words carried the weight of someone who understood that real change comes from speaking up. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause. An elderly veteran made his way forward, tears in his eyes, and shook Chen's hand. "Thank you, son," he said. "This is what serving our country really means." Others joined in, showing their support not just for Chen, but for what he stood for. The head of security nodded. "I'd assure you, Staff Sergeant, this will be thoroughly investigated. We're going to use this incident to retrain our entire staff." She turned to address the crowd. "I apologize to everyone who had to witness this. This is not what we stand for." As Reynolds was led away, people began sharing their videos and contact information with Chen. A law student in the crowd offered to help file the complaint. "This kind of documentation is important," she said. "It helps make sure real changes happen." The morning sun had risen higher now, its light filling the terminal. Chen checked his watch. His surprise homecoming was still on track. But he'd done something even more important than making a flight. He'd shown everyone watching, especially the young people, that standing up for what's right, with dignity and courage, can make a real difference. Word spread through the airport like wildfire. By the time Staff Sergeant Chen reached his gate, airline staff were already waiting for him. The gate agent, a friendly woman with warm eyes, walked up to him right away. "We've heard what happened at security," she said softly. "We'd like to upgrade you to first class as a small token of our respect." Chen tried to decline politely, but the agent insisted. "Please," she said, "it's the least we can do. And thank you, not just for your military service, but for standing up back there. We needed someone to do that." Her eyes were sincere, reflecting what many airport employees had thought but couldn't say. As Chen sat in the gate area, people kept coming up to share their support. A flight attendant brought him a coffee and a sandwich. "On the house," she smiled. "You must be hungry after all that." Chen accepted gratefully, realizing he hadn't eaten since his overseas flight. A group of high school students on a class trip sat nearby, stealing glances at him. Finally, their teacher brought them over. "Would you mind if my students asked you a few questions?" she asked. "They're working on a project about civic responsibility, and, well, they just witnessed a perfect example." Chen talked with the students, answering their thoughtful questions about standing up for what's right. One quiet student raised her hand and asked, "Weren't you scared?" Standing up to authority like that? Chen smiled gently. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," he explained. "It means doing what's right even when you are scared." Meanwhile, the videos from the security checkpoint were already making rounds on social media. The airport's customer service desk was flooded with calls and messages from people demanding action. The incident had struck a chord with thousands who had experienced similar treatment but hadn't been able to stand up for themselves. A young family sitting across from Chen's gate caught his attention. Their little boy, maybe 6 years old, was wearing a toy soldier's costume. The boy's father explained that they were heading to a grandparents' retirement party. The little boy looked at Chen with wide eyes and said, "Dad says you're a real hero. Not because you're a soldier, but because you help people who need help." Chen felt a lump in his throat. He thought about his own kids waiting at home, not knowing their dad was already on his way. He hoped that someday they'd understand why he'd taken a stand today, why some moments require us to speak up even when it's difficult. The boarding process began, and as Chen waited in line, his phone buzzed. It was an email from the airport authority. They wanted to work with him to develop new training programs for security staff. "Your experience today," the email read, "could help prevent this from happening to others." Just then, an elderly couple who had witnessed the whole scene at security approached him. The woman had tears in her eyes as she spoke. "We lived through times when people stayed quiet about these things," she said. "Seeing you stand up today, it gives us hope that things are really changing." As Chen finally settled into his seat on the plane, he looked out the window at the morning sun. The flight attendant discreetly handed him a stack of handwritten notes from other passengers. Messages of support, thanks, and encouragement. One note particularly caught his eye. "My daughter watched you today. She saw what courage looks like. Thank you for teaching her that lesson." Nobody on that flight knew that this incident would lead to major changes in airport security training nationwide. They didn't know that in the coming weeks, Chen's stand would inspire others to speak up against unfair treatment. But right then, as the plane began to taxi, everyone knew they had witnessed something important. A moment when one person's courage reminded everyone of their own power to make a difference. As Chen's plane soared through the clouds, the story of what happened at the airport security checkpoint was taking on a life of its own. Someone had posted their video online with the caption, "Hero Soldier Stands Up to Discrimination," and it was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. Back at the airport, the head of security was already making changes. She'd called an emergency meeting with all security staff, gathering them in the large conference room. "What happened today is not who we are," she told them firmly. The room was silent as she played the videos, showing exactly how not to treat people. Meanwhile, in the terminal, passengers who'd witnessed the incident were still talking about it. A young girl was telling her friends on the phone, "You should have seen him. He was so calm and brave. Like the heroes in the movies, but this was real." Her excitement captured how everyone felt about seeing someone stand up for what's right. The elderly couple who had recorded everything were showing their video to their grandson over a video call. "This is what we mean when we say one person can make a difference," the grandmother explained. Her grandson, a college student studying law, was already writing a paper about how small acts of courage can create big changes. In the airport's break room, the young TSA officer who had wanted to help earlier was sharing her thoughts with coworkers. "I always worried about speaking up," she admitted. "But after today, I know we have to. We can't just watch when something's wrong." Her colleagues nodded in agreement, all of them thinking about times they should have said something. The story reached local news stations. A reporter who happened to be at the airport started interviewing witnesses. "It wasn't just what he did," one businessman explained, adjusting his tie. "It was how he did it, with dignity, respect, and strength. He showed us all how to stand up for ourselves and others." The airport's customer service desk kept getting calls and messages. People weren't just commenting on the incident, they were sharing their own stories. A mother called to tell how her son, who wanted to join the military, now had a new reason. "He says he wants to be brave like that soldier, standing up for what's right." Social media was buzzing with comments from people all over the country. "This is what real patriotism looks like," one person wrote. "Standing up for the values we believe in, making sure everyone is treated fairly." The comments section filled with similar messages of support and inspiration. The head of airport security was already drafting new guidelines. She'd been wanting to make changes for a while, but now she had the perfect example to show why they were needed. "We're going to use this incident in our training," she told her team. "Not to shame anyone, but to learn how to do better." In the terminal gift shop, the cashier overheard customers talking about what happened. "I've worked here for 10 years, she told them, "and I've never seen anything unite people like this." Everyone who saw it happen walked away changed. She was right. The incident had touched something deep in everyone who witnessed it. Back in the air, Chen had no idea about the impact he was having. He was just thinking about getting home, about hugging his kids, about the surprise on their faces when they saw him. But his simple act of standing up with dignity and courage was sparking conversations and changes that would last long after his flight landed. Little did he know that this story would become part of the airport's official training program, teaching future security officers about respect, dignity, and fair treatment. His stand for justice was turning into something bigger than himself. It was becoming a lesson in how ordinary people can make extraordinary changes just by doing what's right. The impact of that morning's events continued to grow. As Chen's plane began its descent into his hometown airport, the video had already reached military communities across the country. Veterans groups were sharing it with messages like, "This is what we fought for. The courage to stand up for what's right at home, not just overseas." A group of military spouses started an online support group inspired by the incident. "We need to share our stories," wrote one military wife. "My husband faced the same treatment last month, but we didn't know how to speak up. Now we do." The group grew quickly, becoming a place where people could find support and guidance for handling similar situations. At the airport where it all began, things were changing fast. The head of security had posted a public statement. "We are reviewing all our procedures and retraining our entire staff. What happened today showed us where we need to do better." She meant every word. Already, she'd scheduled sensitivity training sessions for all security personnel. The young TSA officer who had wanted to help Chen started a discussion group among her colleagues. "We need to talk about these things," she said during their break. "About when to speak up, how to support each other in doing the right thing." Her coworkers listened intently, sharing their own experiences and concerns. Online, people were doing more than just watching the video. They were starting conversations about courage in everyday life. A teacher in Texas wrote, "I showed this to my students today. We talked about what it means to be brave, not just in big moments, but in small ones too." Her post got thousands of responses from other teachers wanting to do the same. The airline Chen had flown on took notice too. Their corporate office released a statement announcing new training programs for all staff, focusing on fair treatment and respect for all passengers. "Today's incident reminded us that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity," their statement read. "We're committed to making that happen." Back in the terminal, the story had taken on a life of its own. A coffee shop barista overheard customers talking about it all day. "It's amazing," she told her coworker. "People aren't just angry about what happened. They're inspired by how it was handled. They're talking about making changes in their own lives." The elderly couple who had recorded the incident were still at the airport, waiting for their delayed flight. They'd spent hours showing their video to others and sharing the story. "In our day," the husband said, "people often stayed quiet. But that soldier showed us it's never too late to speak up." His wife nodded, adding, "And look how many people stood with him." Military bases across the country started receiving reports of similar incidents. But now, there was a difference. People weren't just accepting unfair treatment anymore. They were standing up, calmly and firmly, just like Chen had done. His example was giving others the courage to speak up for themselves. A flight attendant who had witnessed everything wrote about it in the airline's internal newsletter. "I've seen all kinds of situations in my 20 years of flying," she wrote. "But I've never seen someone handle discrimination with such dignity and strength. It changed how I think about my own role in speaking up." As the sun began to set, the airport felt different. Security lines moved with a new sense of respect and awareness. Officers took extra care to treat everyone fairly. The head of security had posted reminder cards at every checkpoint. "Treat everyone with the respect they deserve. We're here to keep people safe, not to judge them." The ripple effects of that morning's stand for justice were just beginning. Nobody knew yet that this story would be used in training sessions across the country, or that it would inspire new policies in airports nationwide. But everyone who had witnessed it knew they'd seen something important. A reminder that one person's courage could light the way for others to follow. 3 days after the incident, Chen sat in his living room, surrounded by his family, watching as the story continued to make waves across the country. His kids had been overjoyed by his surprise early return, but now they were even prouder watching their dad become a symbol of standing up for what's right. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages of support. A military support organization had reached out, asking him to speak at their next conference about handling discrimination with dignity. "Your story is exactly what people need to hear," the invitation read. "It shows that real strength isn't about power. It's about doing what's right." The airport where everything happened had undergone remarkable changes. The head of security had kept her word. New training programs were already in place, and every security officer was required to attend workshops about fair treatment and respect. The young officer who had wanted to help that day was now leading some of these sessions, sharing what she had learned. Chen's wife sat next to him on the couch, reading comments from people online. "Listen to this one," she said softly. "My grandfather is a veteran who faced similar treatment for years but never knew how to fight it. Your husband showed us all how to stand up with dignity." Chen squeezed her hand, thinking about all the others who had faced similar situations. The video had reached military bases worldwide. Commanders were using it in their leadership training sessions, showing how true courage sometimes means taking a stand on home soil. A general sent Chen a personal message. "You displayed the same bravery here that we expect on the battlefield, protecting the values we fight for." Local schools had started including the incident in their civics lessons. A middle school teacher wrote to Chen about how her students were deeply moved by the story. "They keep asking questions about courage and standing up for others," she wrote. "Your example made these big ideas real for them." The airline industry took notice too. Major carriers began reviewing their security procedures, making sure they balanced safety with respect. The airline Chen had flown that day went even further, creating a passenger advocacy team to prevent similar incidents. In the airport's break room, things had changed. Security officers were having open discussions about their experiences and biases. "Remember what the soldier said that day," one officer reminded his colleagues. "It's not just about following rules, it's about treating everyone with dignity." Chen's little daughter drew a picture at school, her dad in his uniform, standing tall at the airport. "My dad's a hero," she wrote underneath. "Not just because he's a soldier, but because he helps make things better for everyone." The picture now hung proudly on their refrigerator. The elderly couple who had recorded the incident sent Chen a heartfelt letter. "We've seen a lot of changes in our lifetime," they wrote. "But it's people like you who remind us that change happens one brave act at a time. Thank you for showing our grandchildren what courage looks like." Support groups started forming at airports across the country. They weren't just for military personnel. They were for anyone who had faced unfair treatment. "If you could stand up with such dignity," one organizer said, "we can too. We just needed someone to show us how." As evening fell, Chen sat on his back porch, watching his kids play in the yard. His phone buzzed with another message. The airport authority wanted him to help develop their new training materials. He smiled, thinking about how a simple act of standing up for what's right had turned into something so much bigger than himself. This wasn't just a story about one incident anymore. It had become a lesson about how change happens, not always through grand gestures, but through ordinary people finding the courage to stand up for what's right, treating others with respect, and inspiring others to do the same. 6 months after that memorable morning at the airport, the changes that started with one soldier's brave stand had grown into something remarkable. Chen sat in a large auditorium, watching as the head of the Transportation Security Administration stood at the podium, announcing new nationwide guidelines for respectful security screening. "It took one person's courage to show us where we needed to change," she said, gesturing toward Chen and the audience. The room was packed with airport officials, security personnel, and civil rights advocates. Everyone knew the story that had brought them here. It had become a symbol of how standing up for what's right could create real change. The airport where it all began had transformed completely. Security lines moved smoothly now, with officers treating everyone with the same respect and dignity. The young officer who had wanted to help that day had been promoted to training supervisor. "We show the video to every new officer," she explained to a reporter. "It teaches them that security and respect go hand in hand." Chen's kids had written out their dad for school assignments. His son's essay, titled "My Dad's Different Kind of Courage," had won a statewide competition. "My dad fights for our country overseas," he wrote, "but he also fights for what's right at home. That's what real heroes do." The elderly couple who witnessed everything that day had started a community group called Stand Up, Speak Out. They visited schools and community centers, sharing their video and teaching people about the power of peaceful resistance. "We're too old to be quiet anymore," the wife would say with a smile. "That brave soldier taught us that." Military bases had made the incident part of their standard training. Before you serve overseas, instructors would tell new recruits, "Remember what you're fighting for here at home." Chen's story had become a perfect example of defending American values on American soil. The airline industry had changed too. Companies competed to show their commitment to fair treatment, with new training programs and passenger rights initiatives. The airline Chen had flown that day was recognized for having the most comprehensive anti-discrimination policies in the industry. In the airport's break room, a framed quote hung on the wall: "Courage isn't just for battlefields." Below it was a picture from that morning, showing Chen standing tall in his uniform, demonstrating that real strength comes from standing up for what's right with dignity and respect. Social media groups dedicated to sharing similar stories had grown into active communities. People posted about standing up to unfair treatment, always referring back to how Chen had handled his situation. "Stay calm, know your rights, and treat everyone with respect, even those who don't show it to you," became their unofficial motto. Chen's wife had started a support group for military families dealing with discrimination. "My husband showed us that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak up," she told new members. The group had chapters at military bases across the country, helping others find their voice. The high school students who witnessed the incident that day had graduated, but they hadn't forgotten. Many wrote college essays about how that morning changed their view of courage and citizenship. One student even started a civic engagement club called Everyday Heroes, inspired by what she saw. As Chen walked through airports now, he often noticed the changes. Security officers made eye contact, smiled, and treated everyone with respect. Sometimes, people would recognize him and share their own stories of standing up for what's right. Each story showed how his simple act of courage had created ripples of change. The final proof of change came in an unexpected way. Officer Reynolds, who had been retrained and relocated, sent Chen a letter. "You taught me something that day," he wrote. "Real security comes from respect, not fear. Thank you for helping me become a better person." This wasn't just a story about one morning at an airport anymore. It had become a lesson about how change happens in the real world, through ordinary people finding the courage to stand up, the wisdom to do it with dignity, and the patience to let their example inspire others to do the same.